Good afternoon, everyone. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Mike Wishnie, and it's terrific to be here today. In the aftermath of the terrible tragedy last week, it's tempting to spend our time talking about migration policy writ large and to overlook the centrality of mental health and mental health policy in the experience of refugees and migrants around the world. But we're not going to do that. We are going to talk about mental health, which is too often pushed a bit to the side. To start with a few facts, many refugees are exposed to trauma. They're exposed to trauma in their home country and the conditions that compel them to flee. They're exposed to trauma during the journey to safety, if they can reach it. And they're exposed to trauma when they arrive, in many situations, in the camps and in their treatment and in the camps. As of the end of last year, UNHCR estimated that there is over 100 million forcibly displaced persons in the world, of whom approximately 40 million are refugees or asylum seekers. So not everyone exposed to trauma, of course, experiences a mental health challenge, but many do. The recent literature survey looking at hundreds of studies of the prevalence of mental health conditions among refugees concluded that approximately 31% of refugees have PTSD, another 31% meet diagnostic criteria for depression, and 11% for anxiety. That was a study of studies. Some individual studies have found rates as high as 80 or 90% of particular populations. In the United States, the laws protecting persons with a disability sweep more broadly even than diagnostic criteria. That is to say that it is not necessary to have a clinical diagnosis to be subject to the protections of disability law in the United States and many other countries. So this has a lot of implications for thinking about refugee and migrant populations, including for the necessary psychosocial supports for people after they reach safety. Becca's organization, IRAP, recently issued a terrific report and toolkit for federal, state, and local governments thinking about psychosocial supports and other mental health programs for refugees who have reached a place of safety. But I want to talk briefly about implications of two other kinds. First, the implications for refugee processing. If one takes seriously that a substantial number of refugees have a diagnosed mental health condition or otherwise qualify for protection under disability laws, that actually would require a very different kind of processing from the interviews and screenings that happen in the United States and many countries. It would require accommodating disabilities such as PTSD that can have such profound impacts on memory, concentration, and ability to communicate. It might require radically altering the way we do processing, to slow it down, to revise our architecture, our training of staff, to provide counsel, to allow for repeated questioning. It may even, in some cases, require delaying the processing until someone can reach a place of stability sufficient to communicate their experience to someone who will decide whether to believe them or not and give them protection. It may, in some cases, require release from detention, because the fact of detention alone interacts with a mental health condition that precludes someone from telling their story in a way that can be understood by the person who will decide whether to allow them to stay or to return them to a place of persecution. If one thinks about people in a wheelchair trying to access a courthouse, you would never say, we're not going to build you a ramp to go to your hearing. But for refugees with mental health conditions, the ramp that they need to meaningfully participate in their hearings may look very different from the kinds of conditions that interviews are conducted today. Second and finally, the prevalence of mental health in conditions among refugee populations may have significant implications for the stories we tell. Many panels to this conference have talked about the importance of storytelling in policy change and social change. It's maybe difficult for many people to connect their life experience with the experience of a refugee who may look different, may talk differently, may seem to have entirely different life experiences, and that othering does not help bring generous policies. But disability can be a point of contact. Many decision makers, from judges to politicians, are also older and may have had a personal experience of disability themselves or know someone with a disability. Talking about refugees with disabilities may allow a story that actually connects with a decision maker who otherwise thinks they have no point in common. And so the implications of thinking seriously about mental health in refugee populations may actually counterintuitively expand opportunities to find common ground across difference.
Thanks, Mike. Hi, I'm Becca. I have a lot of stuff in my lap, so if it all falls on the floor, don't interpret that as like a metaphor for anything. It's just that I'm a klutz. I want to focus in on two particular areas where I think migration intersects with trauma and mental health issues. The first is family separation, and the second, as Mike alluded to a bit, is just the process of going through refugee resettlement or asylum seeking in the first place. Family separation is something that happens to many, many, many displaced people. A lot of the time it's something that happens by chance because of the way that a journey or a flight or being in hiding has to work. And sometimes it's something that happens on purpose because a government is trying to divide families as a punishment to try to prevent people from seeking safety within their borders. And they think that if we can make showing up at the border as bad as whatever you're fleeing from, maybe you won't come anymore. Which is, I think, cruel and also, frankly, delusional and not a good solution to family separation. The UN High Commissioner for Refugees estimates that there are 2 to 3 million displaced people in the world who are eligible for legal family separation, meaning like instead of getting in a raft, they can just get on a plane and land somewhere, who aren't applying because they either don't know that they're eligible or they don't know how to navigate the super complicated process. So my organization, the International Refugee Assistance Project, is standing up the first global legal aid program to try to reunite separated families all over the world in legal ways. And to quote the British Somali poet Warsan Shira in a poem called Home, no one flees home unless home is the mouth of a shark, and no one puts their child in a boat unless the water is safer than the land. So institutions and governments and civil society who are dealing with refugees need to prioritize keeping families together for folks' mental health, for their dignity, and also because being with your family is the single biggest predictor of successful rebuilding and integration in a new country. It's about community, and the heart of community is family, whatever that means to you. I also want to speak for 1 minute and 23 seconds about the process. The process of being a refugee and an asylum seeker is a nightmare in a lot of ways, but one of them is that in order to qualify for asylum or for refugee status, you basically have to prove that something really horrible happened to you. And the way that you have to do that is that you get interviewed multiple times, and often for like 3 to 4 hours at a time, about what's probably the worst thing that ever happened in your life. And having to go into that level of detail about that sort of event over and over and over again means that the process by which we try to protect people actually tends to re-traumatize folks. And so the policy solution that I would suggest for that, there's a fancy legal word called presumption, and we could get all deep in that in a different panel, but I would just say, try believing people. Like, if someone flees Islamic State-occupied Mosul, gets to a neighboring country, stays in a camp for 10 years, and goes to apply for asylum, maybe we could just take their word for it that they wouldn't have done all of that if something really, really bad weren't forcing them to in the first place, and not cause people to relive their trauma in a pretty adversarial atmosphere where basically someone's trying to see if you're lying in order to get the protective status that we're allegedly offering them. So with that, I'm happy to turn it over to Mamady, who will share a bit about his own experience, and he'll be sharing in Greek. So for those of you who need to translate from Greek to something else, it's time to put on your headsets.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for having given me the chance to be here tonight. Mamady Fofana is my name, from Guinea, 22. Many years ago, I had a happy life. I was living with my family. I would go to school as other children of my age. I never imagined that I would come to Europe. My dream was to become a physician, to save lives. But everything changed when I lost my parents because of the civil war. God may rest their soul. A few days after the funeral of my father, I was still in shock. My uncle said that we were in danger and we had to flee for our safety. So we left Guinea, and the first country we reached was Iran. Until I reached Greece, I was faced with violence, danger, hunger, violence by traffickers, and until before reaching the country, we didn't have any water to drink or any food to eat. Those who could not walk were abandoned on the street. In Turkey, we stayed in an abandoned house until we could find money to go on board a boat to come to Greece. When I reached Greece, I was 16, and I thought that the nightmare was over, but it was exactly the opposite. A few days before my asylum application, I woke up and found a letter with 20 euro from my uncle, who was apologizing for having to flee without taking me with him. I was in shock again, disappointed, frustrated. I didn't know what to do. I was in a camp. I had never traveled so far in my life. I didn't know anyone there. I felt so lonely there. But at the end, I was transferred in a camp with other kids. I was feeling better. And in Greece, I was helped by many different organizations. I got to know people, friends who cared for me. And I was feeling I had a family here. I was feeling I had a family and a life in Greece, but the most important thing was that I found love and trust, and I was able to stand on my own feet and make a new start. So in 2019, I started attending school. I sat the national exams. I didn't manage to go into the School of Medicine. When I became of age, I thought I could pursue my dream again. So I started nursing, and now I'm doing my internship in Sotiria Hospital. I admit that I was faced with many difficulties. I have to admit it. I was faced with many challenges before fleeing my country, during the journey, but also in Greece, where I arrived. I was faced with the same problems faced by many refugees or migrants who were forced to flee the country without having any other choice. All those people are in a state of shock, which is traumatic for mental health. I'm proud today for doing a job, being able to help those people. I'm working for the program Community Social Worker in collaboration with EPEPC, in collaboration with the High Commissioner of the UN for Refugees. Refugees such as me are offering mental health assistance to those people. So as a refugee, I can make my compatriots feel more comfortable, because they know I've been through the same, and they are more open. They can discuss what is stressful for them, what they have been through. And the fact that I'm speaking the same language makes it easier for them. The important thing is that this program offers employment possibilities for refugees. And then with our salary, we can be independent and cover our expenses. I hope that having given this chance from EPAPC in collaboration with UN High Commissioner for Refugees, I can help those people with my example, because despite the difficulties they have been through, I want to show them that they can still manage and that there are still opportunities for them. Thank you very much for your time.
Allô? Mamadou, merci beaucoup. Je sais que tu parles français. I'm extending my gratitude to Mamadou, and I also want to thank you for taking us through this very sensitive topic. And as a refugee myself, who was obliged to flee his home country at a very young age, I strongly connect to this. And I want to congratulate you for all what you have achieved, and also you for the long-time commitment work that you have been doing for this marginalized group of our community. So, unfortunately, for time's sake, I'll be taking just one question, and the question is going to be mine. So, you'll take it like that. And I would like to say that there is no doubt that separating families from their loved ones has long-term damaging mental health consequences on community as a whole. I mean, like separating children. I mean, like I expressed it in firsthand, and I know what it means. My question to you is like, how can we improve these services? How can we improve mental health services for this marginalized group of our community?
I'm going to assume that the family separation was somewhat aimed at me, so I'll go first. I think there's a ton of things that we can do. I mean, there's a lot of really interesting interventions like Papsy's doing, that Mamady's working on, sort of working with folks who have already arrived somewhere and providing psychosocial support. I think providing psychosocial support during the process of seeking asylum and refugee status is very important. One intervention that I know Mike and I have both done that I like is bringing in psychiatrists and psychologists to work with people who have trouble testifying about their own trauma, and then write like an expert witness report saying like, if Becca comes up and she's talking about this horrible thing that happened, but maybe she doesn't cry, or she's not emotional, or she forgets a detail, that's not because she's lying, right? That is because that is the way that trauma manifests after like a really crucial event. I also just think there is no global program focused on reuniting families right now. Like there's nothing. The United Nations has tried a number of things, and they mostly haven't worked because people just get stuck on like crazy requirements of the process. So for example, there was a backlog of about 8,000 Eritrean kids trying to reunite with a parent in Germany, and they were all rejected because they didn't have passports. But under EU law, a refugee doesn't have to have a passport, but nobody noticed. So we came in and started working on those cases, and then we're like, oh shit, this shouldn't be happening, right? And went to court in Germany and won that the kids didn't need passports anymore. But there needs to be a lot more of that on a much larger scale, not just focusing on sort of traditional refugee resettlement and asylum pathways, but other legal pathways that exist that can reunite families and that are built in enough in the sort of law and fabric of a society that if a leader takes over a country who's anti-migrant, that those pathways still exist.
I will add two things. First, on the family reunification, families belong together. I think we all know that. And it's not only in my interest to be with my children or my parents, it's in my interest that Becca and Mamady and you get to live with your family too. We are knit together in our communities, in our nations, in the world. And it is not, I am not unaffected by your distance and separation from your family, just as you are not unaffected from me. And I don't mean that just in a general theoretical sense. I mean that in a very concrete way. There should be a human right to family integrity. And there are some cases beginning to recognize that, but it's not the experience in the world. Second, on the mental health piece, one additional thing to the many suggestions Becca made is what's happening here, simply naming it. People in acute distress who just arrived have immediate needs for housing and food and maybe have visible physical conditions that need medical attention. Mental health is often pushed to the side. We'll get to it, it'll come later, but it can be every bit as acute as any other human need. And so simply naming that, as is happening here in this conference, is a big step to treating it as important as any other human need.
Wonderful, extremely well put. Thank you very much. Exclusion is a reality, inclusion is the solution. And we'll have more great examples like Mamadou. Thank you very much.
Merci.